In 1848, a Scottish botanist disguised himself as a Chinese merchant, shaved the front of his head, wore a fake Q braid, and traveled deep into regions of China where foreigners faced execution if discovered. He was not a spy for a foreign army. He was working for the British East India Company, and his mission was to steal the single most valuable trade secret in the world, exactly how China grew, processed, and manufactured tea. This is the story of how one man's espionage broke a 3,000-year Chinese monopoly and quietly reshaped the entire global economy. By the early 19th century, tea had become an economic and cultural obsession in Britain, consumed across every social class and generating enormous tax revenue for the British government through import duties. There was just one serious problem. China held an absolute monopoly on tea production since the tea plant Camellia sinensis was cultivated almost exclusively within Chinese borders, and the Chinese government tightly restricted foreign access to the interior regions where tea was actually grown and processed. Western traders were largely confined to a small number of coastal trading ports,
move those crates
most notably Canton, and had essentially no direct access to tea plantations, processing facilities, or the specific cultivation and manufacturing techniques Chinese growers had refined over centuries. That monopoly created a massive and increasingly uncomfortable trade imbalance for Britain. The British were paying enormous sums in silver to purchase Chinese tea, since China had comparatively little interest in most British manufactured goods, and this persistent trade deficit became a significant economic and political concern for British officials, and notably for the British East India Company, the powerful chartered corporation that held official control over most British trade with Asia and effectively administered vast portions of British colonial policy in the region. The East India Company's solution to this trade imbalance is itself a genuinely dark chapter of history, involving the large-scale export of opium grown in British-controlled India into China, deliberately creating mass addiction to help offset the silver flowing out of Britain for tea purchases,
line moves directly
a policy that directly precipitated the Opium Wars between Britain and China. But alongside that brutal approach to fixing the trade deficit, the East India Company pursued a second, quieter strategy, breaking China's tea monopoly entirely by transplanting tea cultivation to British-controlled territory in India, where the climate in certain regions appeared potentially suitable.
Just 2
if
copper
only
coins.
British agents could actually obtain viable tea plants, seeds, and just as critically, the specific manufacturing knowledge required to process raw tea leaves into a finished, sellable product. This is where Robert Fortune enters the story. Fortune was a Scottish botanist who had already established a professional reputation through earlier plant-collecting expeditions to China on behalf of the Royal Horticultural Society, giving him genuine botanical expertise along with some prior first-hand experience navigating Chinese customs, language, and travel restrictions. In 1848, the East India Company specifically recruited Fortune for an audacious mission: travel into the restricted interior regions of China where tea was actually cultivated and manufactured, regions legally off limits to foreigners under penalty of severe punishment, and systematically obtain both the physical tea plants themselves and the detailed, closely guarded manufacturing knowledge Chinese tea producers had developed and protected for centuries. To accomplish this, Fortune adopted an elaborate and genuinely risky disguise, presenting himself as a Chinese merchant from a distant province, an identity intended to explain away any unfamiliarity with local customs or dialect that a truly local Chinese traveler would have immediately noticed. Historical accounts describe Fortune shaving the front portion of his head and wearing a fake braided queue, the traditional hairstyle mandated for Chinese men under Qing dynasty rule, along with adopting Chinese clothing, in an effort to pass, at least at a distance and in brief interactions, as a Chinese traveler rather than the European foreigner he actually was. Given that foreigners caught traveling illegally in restricted Chinese interior regions during this period faced serious legal consequences, potentially including execution, Fortune's mission carried genuine substantial personal risk throughout his multiple expeditions into China's tea-growing regions over the following several years. Fortune's espionage was remarkably systematic and thorough, extending well beyond simply acquiring physical tea plants and seeds, though he did successfully obtain and transport substantial quantities of both. He also worked to document and understand the specific manufacturing processes Chinese tea producers used, techniques that had been closely guarded trade knowledge for centuries, and that Western traders and botanists had previously struggled to fully understand or replicate. Among his most historically significant discoveries was learning definitively that green tea and black tea, which many Westerners at the time believed came from entirely different plant species, were in fact produced from the exact same tea plant, with the dramatic differences in appearance, flavor, and color resulting entirely from different processing and oxidation techniques applied after harvesting, a genuinely fundamental piece of botanical and manufacturing knowledge that had simply never been accurately understood or documented outside China prior to Fortune's investigations. Fortune also recognized that successfully transplanting Chinese tea cultivation to India would require more than plants and technical knowledge alone. It would require skilled Chinese tea workers who actually understood the practical, hands-on manufacturing techniques involved in processing raw leaves into finished tea, since written documentation alone could not fully capture the nuanced, experience-based skill involved in tea manufacturing. Fortune successfully recruited a number of experienced Chinese tea workers to relocate to India specifically to help establish and train new tea plantation operations there, transferring not just plants and seeds, but genuine human expertise and manufacturing skill directly into British colonial tea operations. The physical logistics of transporting live tea plants from China to India across a genuinely difficult months-long sea voyage presented their own serious challenge, since tea plants and seeds were notoriously prone to dying during extended ocean transport under the growing conditions available at the time. Fortune's solution involved making extensive use of a relatively recent horticultural innovation called the Wardian case, an early type of sealed glass terrarium originally developed in Britain specifically for successfully transporting live plants over long ocean voyages by protecting them from salt spray while still allowing light in and maintaining a stable, humid microclimate inside the sealed case. Using this technology, Fortune was able to successfully transport a substantial quantity of live tea plants to India in significantly better condition than earlier, less careful transport attempts had achieved. The tea plants, seeds, manufacturing knowledge, and skilled workers Fortune successfully brought to India became foundational to the rapid establishment and expansion of British tea cultivation in India, particularly across the Assam and Darjeeling regions over the following decades. Indian tea production grew dramatically throughout the second half of the 19th century, eventually growing large enough that India overtook China entirely as the world's largest tea producer and exporter by the early 20th century, a genuinely remarkable transformation from a starting position of having essentially no established domestic tea industry just decades earlier. The broader economic and political consequences of this shift were significant and lasting. Breaking China's centuries-old tea monopoly fundamentally altered global trade patterns, significantly reduced Britain's dependence on Chinese tea imports, and helped establish India as a major agricultural and economic force within the British colonial economic system, specifically built around tea export, a transformation with consequences that extended well beyond the tea industry itself, and that continued shaping India's economic and agricultural landscape for well over a century afterward, with Indian tea production, particularly from Assam and Darjeeling, remaining globally significant and internationally recognized to this day. What began as 3,000 years of closely guarded Chinese agricultural and manufacturing secrecy around one of the world's most economically valuable crops was ultimately broken not through military conquest or open negotiation, but through one disguised Scottish botanist's genuinely audacious, sustained campaign of industrial espionage, carried out at real personal risk across multiple expeditions into forbidden Chinese territory, quietly and permanently reshaping global agricultural trade and the economic fortunes of two entire nations in the process. If this story surprised you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Drop a comment and tell us what other hidden history behind an everyday drink you want us to investigate next.